What I realized about you didn't arrive as a sudden thought or an emotional rush. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't interrupt my day. It quietly altered the way everything else started to make sense. That's how I know it mattered. Real realizations don't demand attention. They change perspective. I didn't wake up one morning with clarity. Clarity formed over time through repetition, through moments that seemed ordinary until they weren't. What stood out wasn't something you did once. It was something you didn't stop doing. Consistency. I realized that being around you didn't pull my focus away from my life. It sharpened it. My thinking became cleaner. Decisions felt less complicated. Noise I didn't even realize I was carrying faded into the background. That shift doesn't come from excitement. It comes from alignment. Alignment changes how you see everything. I started noticing how my reactions softened. Not because I cared less, but because I trusted more. Trust removes the need for constant vigilance. When you stop scanning for problems, you start seeing possibilities. That's when my perspective changed. I realized that I wasn't trying to predict you. I wasn't preparing responses or rehearsing conversations. I wasn't bracing for unpredictability. That absence of mental preparation told me something important. I felt safe in the structure, not just the moment. Structure matters more than emotion. I realized that silence around you didn't feel heavy. It felt neutral, sometimes even grounding. Silence didn't signal distance or disinterest. It was just space existing without explanation. When silence stops needing interpretation, something fundamental shifted. That shift changed everything. I also noticed how I stopped measuring things. I wasn't tracking progress or checking milestones. I wasn't asking where things were going. When something fits, direction doesn't feel urgent. It unfolds naturally. Urgency disappeared. I realized that my standards didn't lower, they clarified. Things that once seemed acceptable started feeling unnecessary. Not wrong, just misaligned. That awareness didn't come with judgment. It came with understanding. Understanding recalibrates choice. I realized that you didn't add pressure to my life. You removed some of it. Being connected to you didn't create more responsibility. It's simplicating for lack of depth. Simplicity is often mistaken for lack of depth. In reality, it's a sign of efficiency. Efficient systems last. I realized that I didn't need to be impressive. I didn't optimize my words or manage my tone. I could be direct without consequence. Directness without fallout is rare. It means respect is already present. Respect changes how you communicate. I realized that disagreements didn't feel like threats. They felt like information. Information can be processed calmly. Threats demand reaction. Reaction leads to damage. Calm leads to resolution. Resolution builds trust. I also noticed that my emotional energy stayed balanced. No spikes, no crashes, steadiness. Steadiness allows long-term thinking. Long-term thinking changes how you build everything. I realized that this wasn't about attraction. Attraction fluctuates. This was about coherence. Your actions, tone, and values didn't contradict each other. Coherence creates reliability. Reliability creates confidence. Confidence shifts perspective. I realized that nothing here required management. I wasn't maintaining balance or correcting course. Things stayed balanced on their own. When a system works without supervision, you stop questioning it. You rely on it. I realized that I wasn't escaping into the future or holding on to the past. I was present without effort. Presence without effort is a strong signal. It means nothing is pulling you away internally. That presence changed how I experienced time. I realized that what changed how I see everything wasn't a single moment. It was the absence of instability. No emotional loops, no uncertainty cycles, no hidden volatility. Absence can be proof. I realized that you didn't need constant validation to remain consistent. You didn't create emotional noise to feel close. You simply existed grounded in yourself. Grounded people don't destabilize others. I realized that this understanding didn't make me want to rush anything. It made me want to protect the pace. Protecting pace is respect. Rushing distorts what's real. I realized that clarity didn't demand expression immediately. It waited, it matured, and once it was mature, it didn't need embellishment. That's why I'm saying this now. What I realized about you changed how I see everything. Not because it overwhelmed me, but because it simplified me. It removed friction I had normalized. It showed me what alignment actually feels like when it's real. And once you experience that, you can't unsee it. You stop confusing intensity with connection. You stop mistaking excitement for stability. You stop settling for systems that require constant repair. Your vision adjusts. If you're listening to this and recognizing the moment when something didn't excite you but studied you, you understand exactly what I mean. That moment doesn't shout, it settles. And if this realization resonated with you, if you value clarity, structure, and calm strength, take a moment to like this video. If you appreciate conversations built on long-term thinking and depth, subscribe. And if something here reflected your own experience, leave a comment, even a simple one. Progress matters, perspective matters, and sometimes one realization changes how you see everything. Where I realized about you didn't stop changing how I see everything. It kept doing its work quietly, long after the realization itself had settled. That's how I knew it wasn't momentary insight. It became a lens. Once a lens changes, you don't go back to the old view. I noticed it in how I approached my days. I wasn't trying to optimize motion or chase momentum. I focused on clarity, on flow, on decisions that didn't require correction later. When something reframes your thinking this way, it's no longer about that person alone. It's about how you move through life. That's a meaningful shift. I realized that I stopped filling gaps with interpretation. Silence didn't turn into stories. Delays didn't become doubts. Neutral moments stayed neutral. That told me something fundamental. I trusted the structure beneath the surface. Structure absorbs uncertainty. I also noticed that I wasn't rehearsing conversations. I didn't plan explanations. I spoke plainly without bracing for reaction. That kind of communication only happens when respect is assumed, not requested. Assumed respect is powerful. I realized that my patience changed shape. It wasn't passive waiting. It was active steadiness. I wasn't delaying action out of fear. I was allowing clarity to remain unpressured. Pressure often forces decisions that don't last. Lasting decisions arrive calmly. I noticed how my emotional energy became more predictable, not flat balanced. Balance doesn't dull feeling, it stabilizes it. Stability allows you to think long-term without sacrificing presence. Long-term thinking builds futures. I realized that disagreements no longer felt like interruptions, they felt like data points, information that could be evaluated without defensiveness. When disagreement becomes data, growth becomes possible. Growth requires calm. I also not iced that I didn't idealize you. Idealization distorts reality. I saw you clearly without needing to enhance or protect the image. Reality held out that matters more than fantasy ever could. Reality that holds builds trust. I realized that nothing here demanded acceleration. There's no subtle push to define or secure. The pace felt self-correcting. When pace regulates itself, something is aligned. Alignment doesn't rush. I noticed that I didn't feel the need to monitor consistency. I trusted it. Trust in consistency means you've already seen enough evidence. Evidence removes anxiety. Society fades when evidence accumulates. I realized that my boundaries didn't feel defensive. They were respected without explanation. That kind of respect isn't negotiated, it's offered. And offered respect changes how you experience closeness. Closeness without defense is rare. I also noticed that I wasn't performing care. Care showed up naturally through follow-up attention and presence. Performance fades. Follow-through compounds. Compounding care builds reliability. I realized that my future thinking became more grounded. I didn't imagine extremes, I thought in terms of systems, habits, and sustainability. Sustainability matters more than intensity. Intensity burns out. Sustainability builds life. I noticed that silence between us didn't carry weight. It didn't signal distance. It wasn't something to solve. It simply existed. When silence stops feeling like a problem, trust has already been established. Established trust is quiet. I realized that this shift didn't demand expression. It didn't need to be announced to be valid. It shaped behavior before it ever reached language. Behavior reveals truth. I also noticed that my tolerance for instability elsewhere decreased, not out of judgment but awareness. Once you experience alignment, misalignment becomes obvious without effort. Awareness refines as choice. I realized that this wasn't about connection alone. It was about perspective. The way I evaluated situations, people, and opportunities shifted. I valued coherence over excitement, reliability over novelty. Those priorities changed everything. And notice that nothing here asked me to be more than I am. I didn't stretch to meet expectation. I existed as myself without consequence. Authenticity without penalty is safety. Safety enables growth. I realized that patience didn't feel like delay. It felt like care. Care applied over time preserves what's real. Preservation matters. I also noticed that I didn't feel compelled to secure outcomes. I trusted the process. Trust in process frees you from anxiety about control. Control weakens clarity. I realized that this understanding didn't make me passive. It made me precise. Precision reduces waste of time, energy, and attention. Precision builds efficiency. I noticed that what changed how I see everything wasn't a single insight. It was how that insight continued to prove itself without reinforcement. Roof doesn't need repetition. I realized that this perspective wouldn't reverse even if circumstances changed. It had become internalized. Internalized understanding becomes part of how you think, not just what you think about. Thinking changes direction. I also noticed that gratitude replaced anticipation. I wasn't waiting for something to happen to justify the realization. I appreciated what already existed. Appreciation stabilizes value. I realized that this clarity didn't require me to act immediately. It informed how I would act when the time was right. Timing matters. Right action follows clear vision. What I realized about you changed how I see everything. Not because it demanded attention, but because it removed distortion. It simplified complexity. It sharpened judgment. And once distortion is removed, you don't miss it. If you're listening to this and recognizing the shift from reaction to reflection, you understand exactly what I'm describing. And if this part resonated with you, if you value clarity that changes behavior, not just feeling, take a moment to like this video. If you appreciate thoughtful conversations built on structure and depth, subscribe. And if something here reflected your own experience, leave a comment, even a simple one. Some realizations don't make life louder, they make it clearer. What I realized about you kept changing how I see everything, not by adding new thoughts, but by refining the ones I already had. Refinement is subtle. It doesn't introduce chaos or excitement, it removes excess. And once excess is gone, clarity becomes permanent. I noticed how this realization stopped feeling like something I needed to hold on to. It didn't require memory or attention to stay alive. It became part of how I moved through my days, quietly influencing decisions without interrupting them. That's when I knew it was real. I realized that my internal pace adjusted naturally. I wasn't rushing toward outcomes or dragging my feet out of hesitation. I moved deliberately. Deliberation isn't indecision, it's intention without pressure. Pressure distorts accuracy. I noticed how my expectations became more precise, not higher, not lower, clear. I wasn't asking for more than what was sustainable, and I wasn't settling for less than what was aligned. Precision protects value. Value thrives under clarity. I realized that I stopped reacting to minor fluctuations. I didn't interpret mood changes as instability. I didn't read into pauses or shifts in rhythm. Stability doesn't require constant confirmation. It's visible in how things hold over time. Time reveals structure. I noticed how conversations didn't need framing. I spoke plainly without cushioning or over-explaining. When communication doesn't need protection, trust already exists. Trust removes filters. I realized that my emotional energy stayed evenly distributed. No peaks pulling me forward, no drops pulling me back. Even energy creates space for long-term planning. Planning Chang. ES direction. I noticed that disagreements didn't linger. They resolved without residue. Nothing was stored for later. Nothing was left unsaid to avoid discomfort. Completion is respect in action. Completion prevents erosion. I realized that I wasn't idealizing the connection. Idealization inflates expectations beyond reality. Reality here didn't need inflation. It stood intact. Reality that holds builds confidence. I noticed that nothing required rehearsal. I wasn't preparing for misunderstanding or defensiveness. Trusted clarity to land cleanly. Clarity lands when it's real. I realized that my tolerance for instability elsewhere dropped sharply. Not out of comparison, but out of awareness. Once you experience alignment, misalignment becomes unmistakable. Awareness sharpens standards. I noticed that silence felt constructive. It didn't create anxiety or distance. It created room for thought, for rest, for presence. Space that feels safe is a sign of alignment. Safe space builds trust. I realized that this understanding didn't isolate me from others. It expanded my capacity to be present without distraction. When internal noise quiets, external connection improves. Quiet improves focus. I noticed that patience stopped feeling like waiting. It felt like stewardship. Stewardship means protecting something by letting it grow at its natural pace. Growth resists force. I realized that care didn't arrive as performance, it arrived as consistency, showing up the same way regardless of context. That consistency compounded quietly. Consistency builds reliability. I noticed that my future thinking became more grounded. I wasn't imagining extremes or projecting fantasies. I thought in terms of systems, habits, and sustainability. Sustainable systems last. Lasting systems matter. I realized that this realization didn't demand articulation. It lived comfortably without language. But when language eventually arrived, it matched the understanding perfectly. Alignment between thought and word matters. I noticed that respect remains stable regardless of uncertainty. It didn't fluctuate with clarity or confusion. Stable respect is a foundation. Foundations determine outcomes. I realized that this understanding didn't ask for action-informed readiness. Readiness doesn't rush, it prepares quietly. Preparation prevents regret. I noticed that gratitude replaced anticipation. I wasn't waiting for confirmation. I appreciated what already existed. Appreciation preserves truth. I realized that this perspective wouldn't disappear under pressure. Pressure tested it. It held. What holds under pressure deserves trust. Trust is earned through pressure. I noticed that my behavior changed before my words ever did. Behavior is where truth reveals itself first. Behavior doesn't lie. I realized that this wasn't about discovering something new. It was about recognizing something stable. Stability doesn't demand attention. It earns reliance. Reliance changes how you build. I noticed that nothing here required management. Management implies fragility. This wasn't fragile. Strength doesn't need supervision. I realized that this clarity didn't shrink possibility, it focused it. Focus turns potential into progress. Progress requires focus. I noticed that I wasn't pulled into narratives or hypotheticals. I stayed rooted in what was real. Reality didn't disappoint. Reality held. What I realized about you kept changing how I see everything. Not by adding motion, but by removing distortion. It made choices easier. It made standards clearer. It made direction obvious. And once direction is obvious, you don't wander. That you're listening to this and recognizing the moment when clarity becomes your default, not your exception. You understand exactly what I mean. And if this part resonated with you, if you value precision, steadiness, and truth that compounds over time, take a moment to like this video. If you appreciate conversations built on depth and long-term thinking, subscribe. And if something here reflected your own experience, leave a comment, even a simple one. Some realizations don't change what you feel, they change how you live. What I realized about you continued to change how I see everything. And this part is about what happened when that realization stopped evolving and started stabilizing. Stabilization is different from settling. Settling is passive. Stabilization is earned. It's what happens when something holds its shape without needing constant attention. That's when perspective truly shifts. I noticed that I stopped checking in on the realization itself. I wasn't revisiting it to see if it still felt true. I wasn't testing it against a few moments. It didn't need confirmation. When something integrates fully, you stop monitoring it. You trust it. Trust doesn't ask questions. It answers them quietly. I realized that my decision became more decisive, not rushed, not rigid, just clean. I wasn't accounting for emotional